When you become a police officer, you swear an oath to protect people. You are not supposed to work for criminals. You are not supposed to take their money. You are supposed to arrest them. That is the entire point of the badge. But in countries where drug cartels earn billions of dollars a year, the people running those cartels have a different idea of what a police officer is for. They see a uniform and they see an employee. They offer bribes so large that most officers stop asking questions. And when an officer says no, the cartel does not argue.
It sends gunmen to the officer's house, to the officer's car, to the officer's route to work. Today, we are covering 10 police officers who were killed by cartels for refusing to take the money. What you are about to hear will change how you think about the men and women who put on a badge, in a country where that badge is not a shield, but a target. Section 1. Colonel Voldemar Franklin Quintero. In the summer of 1989, Medellin, Colombia was the most dangerous city in the world. The Medellin cartel, run by Pablo Escobar, had turned the country into a battlefield. Judges were being shot in their courtrooms. Journalists were being taken out in front of their newsrooms. Politicians were being gunned down at public rallies. And the police force meant to fight back was being offered a simple choice: take the money and look the other way, or end up in a coffin. That choice had a name in Colombia: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Most officers took the silver. One colonel did not. Voldemar Franklin Quintero was 48 years old. He had been a police officer for nearly 3 decades, rising slowly through the ranks. He had commanded police forces in Caldas and Boyacá. He had helped free kidnap victims. He had settled a war between emerald miners. In January of 1989, the Colombian National Police sent him to the one place nobody wanted to go. They made him the commander of the Antioquia Police, the department that contained Medellin. His job was to go after Pablo Escobar in Escobar's own backyard. Everyone who knew him understood what the job meant. Voldemar Franklin understood it too. He took the job anyway. What he did next is why this story matters. In 7 months on the job, Colonel Franklin Quintero led a police operation called Operación Arcoiris, Operation Rainbow. In that short period of time, his officers discovered 28 different cocaine processing laboratories hidden across Antioquia and Bolívar. They seized more than 11 tons of cocaine. They arrested over 1,000 people connected to the Medellin cartel, including drug mules, enforcers, and mid-level traffickers. Nothing in Colombian police history had ever hit the cartel that hard, that fast. Every lab he burned down, every kilo he took off the street, was money stolen directly out of Pablo Escobar's pocket. And the cartel came calling, the way it always did. According to multiple accounts from Colombian journalists who covered the case, and later from Escobar's own former lieutenants who wrote memoirs about the era, intermediaries were sent to offer Colonel Franklin Quintero the same deal every other official in Medellin had been offered. Take the money, name your price, let the shipments move, let the laboratories reopen, look the other way, and become a very rich man. The colonel refused. Not once, not twice. He refused every time. He kept raiding, he kept seizing, he kept arresting. On July 4th, 1989, a car bomb went off in Medellin. It killed Antioquia Governor Antonio Roldan Betancourt. Later investigations concluded the bomb was never meant for the governor at all. It was meant for Colonel Franklin Quintero. The governor had simply been in the wrong place. When the colonel found out that innocent people were dying in attempts to get him, he made a decision that still gets talked about in Colombia today. He pulled off his bodyguards. He gave up his police escort. He told people around him that he did not want any more widows and orphans on his account.
If the cartel wanted him, they would have to come for him alone. They came 45 days later. On the morning of August 18, 1989, at around 6:10 a.m., Colonel Franklin Quintero was sitting in the passenger seat of a white Nissan Jeep on Carrera 80 in Medellin. His driver, León Enrique Madrid Sea, was behind the wheel.
A second officer, Miguel Ángel Marín Flores, was also in the vehicle.
They stopped at a red light. 7 hitmen working for the Medellin cartel were waiting for them. The gunmen surrounded the Jeep and opened fire with submachine guns at close range. Witnesses at the intersection told a local radio station that the shooters did not stop firing for several minutes. When it was over, the colonel had been hit 31 times. Some reports put the total number of rounds fired at well over 100. He was dead before paramedics could reach him. His driver and the second officer were wounded but survived. A few hours later, a caller phoned several Medellin radio stations. He identified himself as a member of a group that called itself the Extraditables, a front organization used by the cartel.
He announced that the Extraditables were taking responsibility for the colonel's execution.
He framed it as retaliation against what he called the repression of the Colombian state. The same day Voldemar Franklin Quintero was killed, on the other side of the country at a political rally in the town of Soacha, hitmen working for the same cartel shot dead Luis Carlos Galán, the leading candidate for president of Colombia. August 18, 1989, became the day Colombia finally understood what it was up against. The government of President Virgilio Barco declared a state of siege within hours. Extradition of drug traffickers to the United States, which the cartel had spent years fighting to prevent, was reinstated by emergency decree. The war against Pablo Escobar entered a new and far bloodier phase. The sicario arrested years later in connection with the colonel's killing was named John Jairo Posada Valencia, a young hitman who went by the street name El Titi.
He confessed to taking part in the ambush and was sentenced to 11 years and 7 months in prison.
He never served the full sentence. In October of 1997, he was killed inside La Picota prison in Bogotá. The Attorney General's Office of Colombia was never able to formally prove the Medellin cartel had ordered the hit, even though Pablo Escobar's own former hitmen would later confirm it in their memoirs. Colonel Franklin Quintero left behind a wife and a son. His son would eventually co-write a book about him called El Día que Mataron a mi Papá, The Day They Killed My Dad. What happened in Antioquia set a template the cartels would use for the next 35 years. And the next story shows exactly how that template traveled north, into the jungles of southern Colombia, 3 years before the colonel was ever killed, and landed on a man who was targeted for a raid that changed everything.
Section 2. Brigadier General Haime Ramirez Gomez. Before Colonel Franklin Quintero ever pinned on the Antioquia command patch, another Colombian police officer had already drawn Pablo Escobar's attention. His name was Haime Ramirez Gomez. He was born on July 4, 1940. He joined the National Police of Colombia as a young man and spent the 1970s working his way up through the ranks. He was quiet, methodical, and relentless. The kind of officer who did his paperwork, followed the leads, and actually showed up to make the arrest. By the early 1980s, he had become the national director of the Colombian Drug Enforcement Unit. His office was in Bogotá. His enemies were in Medellin. Ramirez was not a political man. He was a cop. But in the Colombia of the early 1980s, being a cop who took drug trafficking seriously automatically made him political. The Medellin cartel was not just a criminal organization anymore. It was a rival government. Pablo Escobar had been elected to the Colombian Congress in 1982. He was building churches, sponsoring football clubs, and handing out cash in the slums of Medellin. Anyone who got in the way of his cocaine pipeline was offered the usual arrangement: take the bribe,
Keep quiet, get rich. Refuse, and you became a target. Colonel Ramirez had a reputation across Colombia for one thing above all else. He could not be bought. Every intermediary the cartel sent was turned away, so the cartel stopped sending intermediaries. In the early 1980s, Colonel Ramirez was assigned to work alongside a young politician named Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who had just been named Minister of Justice by President Belisario Betancourt. Lara Bonilla had a reputation just like Ramirez. He could not be bought either. Together, the two men assembled a small team of roughly 30 investigators, many of them drawn from outside the traditional police structure, and they went to work on the cartel. They traced dirty money into political campaigns. They traced it into professional football clubs. They found the airfields the cartel was using to fly cocaine out of the country. Minister Lara ordered the grounding of any suspicious flight. Colonel Ramirez carried out the raids. For the first time, the Medellin cartel was being squeezed by the Colombian state in a serious way. And then came Tranquilandia. In early 1984, Colonel Ramirez and his team, working with the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, located something that nobody at the DEA or the Colombian police had ever seen before. Deep in the jungle of the Yari River, in a remote stretch of territory between the Colombian departments of Caqueta and Meta,
The Medellin cartel had built an industrial cocaine production complex.
the cartel had named it Tranquilandia, which translates roughly to tranquil land. It was enormous. The complex covered hundreds of hectares. It contained multiple working cocaine laboratories, along with 8 separate airstrips for the planes flying the product out. It had its own water system, its own electricity, its own medical facilities, and living quarters for the workers. It was essentially a cocaine factory town hidden inside the Amazon. On March 7, 1984, Colonel Ramirez led the raid. The operation, later known as Yari 84, was one of the largest counter-narcotics seizures the world had ever seen. The police and the DEA destroyed the laboratories, burned the airstrips, arrested roughly 40 people at the scene,
And seized close to 13.8 tons of cocaine. The financial loss to the Medellin cartel was catastrophic. Estimates at the time put it in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Pablo Escobar was humiliated. And in Escobar's world, humiliation came with a receipt. 7 weeks later, on April 30th, 1984, hitmen on a motorcycle pulled up alongside a car carrying Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla on a Bogotá street. They opened fire and killed him on the spot. It was the first major assassination of a sitting government minister by the cartel, and it shocked the country. Colonel Ramirez had been Lara's closest partner in the fight. Every Colombian newspaper understood what the killing meant. Lara had been first. Ramirez was next. For the next 2 years, Colonel Ramirez lived under a death sentence that was never formally issued, but never lifted. The cartel put him on a list. His first planned execution was going to be carried out by a sicario known on the streets of Medellin as El Coco, who had been tasked with using a rocket launcher to destroy Ramirez's armored car. El Coco was killed in an unrelated shooting before he could carry out the mission. The cartel simply selected new hitmen and kept waiting for the right moment. That moment came on November 17, 1986. Colonel Ramirez, by then promoted in all but official rank, was returning to Bogotá from a weekend at a family farm. He was driving a white Toyota Land Cruiser. His wife, Helena Mendez Vargas, was with him. His sons, Javier and Haime Ramirez Mendez, were in the back seat. Because it was a Sunday, his usual convoy of bodyguards had been reduced to a single escort vehicle. On a bridge between the Colombian municipalities of Mosquera and Fontibón, 2 hitmen in a green Renault 18 pulled up beside the family. They fired on the escort first, then turned their weapons on the colonel. He was hit and lost control of the Land Cruiser, which crashed into a rock near a nearby police station. The assailants walked up to the vehicle and fired a second burst at point-blank range. Colonel Ramirez was killed almost instantly.
His wife and his 2 sons were not injured. He was 46 years old, and he was exactly 1 month away from what would have been his formal promotion to the rank of Brigadier General.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of a police commander refusing the cartel's silver is not only a Colombian story. 2 decades later, the same offer would be made on the other side of the continent, in a Mexican border city where one brave man took the job that everyone else was too afraid to accept. Section 3. Alejandro Dominguez Co. Nuevo Laredo sits on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande, directly across the border from Laredo, Texas. On a map, it looks ordinary. A working city of around 400,000 people. A major shipping crossing for trucks going in and out of the United States. In the spring of 2005, it was the deadliest city in Mexico. 2 drug cartels, the Gulf Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel, were fighting a street-by-street war to control the trucks that crossed that bridge. The Gulf Cartel had created a brand new armed wing made up of former Mexican Special Forces soldiers. They called themselves Los Zetas. By the middle of that year, more than 60 people had already been killed in Nuevo Laredo since January. 7 of them were police officers. The police chief's job had been open for weeks. Nobody wanted it. Alejandro Dominguez Co wanted it. He was 55 years old. He was not a cop. He was a printing shop owner and a local businessman. He had been the head of the Nuevo Laredo Chamber of Commerce. Years earlier, he had worked inside the Mexican Federal Attorney General's office, which meant he understood how law enforcement worked, even if he had never personally put on a uniform. His uncle was a former Mexican Federal Attorney General. He was a respected man in Nuevo Laredo. He was a father of 3. He had watched the violence tear his city apart for months, and when nobody else would step forward, he did. On the afternoon of June 8, 2005, Alejandro Dominguez Co was sworn in as the new Chief of Public Security for the city of Nuevo Laredo. The ceremony took place at around 3 p.m. at City Hall. Reporters were there. Cameras were there. He stood in front of the microphones, and he said something that reporters later replayed over and over. He said he did not owe anybody anything. He said his duty was to the citizens of Nuevo Laredo. He said the people who should be afraid were the ones who had been compromised. He was calmly telling the cartels that he could not be bought. 6 hours and 40 minutes later, he was dead. At around 10 p.m. that same night, Alejandro Dominguez Co walked out of the offices of the National Business Chamber in downtown Nuevo Laredo, where he had been holding meetings after the swearing-in ceremony. He climbed into his Ford Lobo pickup truck. According to a witness who spoke anonymously to investigators out of fear of retribution, 3 dark Chevy Suburbans pulled up around him. Gunmen opened fire from inside the vehicles, then they got out and kept firing at close range. When the shooting stopped, they got back into their trucks and drove off slowly with their headlights off. Investigators recovered between 35 and 40 spent shell casings from AR-15 assault rifles at the scene. The new police chief had been hit dozens of times. He was the 7th police commander to be killed in Nuevo Laredo that year. The city effectively shut down the next morning. Streets that were normally filled with shoppers and tourists were empty. Federal police drove around in pickup trucks carrying automatic weapons. A local attorney named Zorina Medrano told reporters at City Hall that the people of Nuevo Laredo were defenseless. She pointed out that the Mexican federal government had already sent 700 soldiers and federal agents into the city 2 months earlier, and even they had not been respected by the cartels. She asked out loud who the city was supposed to turn to for help. The Mexican government's response was immediate and dramatic. President Vicente Fox ordered the entire Nuevo Laredo Municipal Police Force disarmed and placed under federal investigation for possible links to the cartels.
Within days, a wave of federal troops and federal agents took control of the city. Dozens of local officers were detained for questioning. In the weeks that followed, at least 50 more people would die in gun battles on the streets of Nuevo Laredo. The border crossing that normally carried billions of dollars of legitimate trade a year became a war zone. Tourists stopped crossing from Texas. American restaurants and bars in the Mexican part of the city emptied out. The United States State Department issued an official travel warning. No one was ever arrested for the killing of Alejandro Dominguez Co. Mexican authorities at the time said the assault rifles used were the same type favored by cartel hitmen, but they announced no suspects. The intelligence assessment inside both the Mexican Federal Police and the United States Drug Enforcement Administration was that the killing had been carried out by Los Zetas on behalf of the Gulf Cartel. The message was designed to be simple. The Gulf Cartel controlled Nuevo Laredo. Any new police chief who did not understand that from his first minute on the job would not live to see his second day. Alejandro Dominguez Co had stood in front of the cameras and said he could not be bought. The cartel made sure no other applicant would ever make that mistake again. In the days after the killing, reporters asked the mayor of Nuevo Laredo, Daniel Peña, how the city planned to find a new police chief. He had no answer. A city councilman named Joaquin Trevino told reporters bluntly that the reality was that nobody wanted the job.
For weeks afterward, nobody did.
The man who had said those who should be afraid were the ones who had been compromised had died within hours of saying it, and every other qualified candidate in the city had taken that warning to heart. The killing of a police chief on his first day terrified an entire border city. But 3 years later, and more than 700 miles to the south, cartels would figure out how to terrify an entire country at once by going after the man at the top of the national police. Section 4. Acting Federal Police Chief. Edgar Myan Gomez. Mexico City in the spring of 2008 was not supposed to be a battlefield. Border towns were war zones. The mountains of Sinaloa were war zones. But the capital, the biggest city in North America, the seat of the Mexican federal government, was supposed to be the one place where the men running the fight against the cartels could actually sleep at night. That assumption was about to end in the most public way possible.
Edgar Myan Gomez was born in Mexico City in 1967. He grew up there, studied law at the Universidad del Valle de Mexico, and joined the Mexican Federal Police straight out of university. He was serious, disciplined, and deeply ambitious. His training took him to police academies in several countries around the world. In 2000, he helped capture one of the most feared kidnappers in Mexican history, a man named Andres Caletri, and helped dismantle two of the biggest abduction rings operating in the country at the time. In 2001, the Mexican government named him head of anti-kidnapping operations for the Federal Agency of Investigation, the Mexican equivalent of the FBI. Under his leadership, his agents rescued the coach of the Cruz Azul soccer team, Ruben Omar Romano, after the coach had been kidnapped in 2005. Myan was widely respected inside the Mexican security establishment as one of the rare high-ranking officers who actually did the work. On March 1st, 2008, at the age of 41, he was named the acting chief of the Federal Preventive Police. That made him the coordinator of every major counter-cartel operation being run by the Mexican Federal Police. Roughly 24,000 Mexican soldiers had been deployed across the country by then, as part of President Felipe Calderón's nationwide crackdown on organized crime. Edgar Myan was the man responsible for making those soldiers and those police officers work together. He took the job knowing exactly what it meant. A federal police spokesman and personal friend of his, Javier Ortiz, later told reporters that Myan had understood from day one that his life was in danger every single minute he held the position. He changed his routine constantly.
He slept at different addresses on different nights. He kept his own personal security team close. And he kept hitting the cartels. In January of 2008, just weeks before he was named acting chief,
Myan had personally overseen one of the most damaging raids the Sinaloa cartel had suffered in years. His officers had tracked down a series of safe houses in Mexico City and captured 11 suspected cartel hitmen along with a massive weapons cache. At a press conference, Myan displayed the seized arsenal in front of rolling cameras. 36 of the captured bulletproof vests were marked with the initials FEDA, which Mexican authorities said stood for Fuerzas Especiales de Arturo, the private armed wing of Arturo Beltrán Leiva, one of the most feared leaders of the Sinaloa cartel. The message to the cartel was clear. Myan was not just signing paperwork from a desk. He was personally in charge of dismantling them. On January 21, 2008, Mexican authorities captured Alfredo Beltrán Leiva, Arturo's brother. The Beltrán Leiva wing of the Sinaloa cartel immediately blamed Myan for the arrest. According to later Mexican intelligence reports, Arturo Beltrán Leiva personally ordered Myan to be killed in retaliation. The plan was carried out on the night of May 8, 2008. A man named Alejandro Ramirez who had a prior record for car theft and who investigators later determined had been hired by a Sinaloa cartel operative, was waiting in the entrance of the apartment building in the Colonia Guerrero neighborhood of Mexico City. Colonia Guerrero is not a wealthy area. Associates of Myan later said he had specifically chosen to live there because it was close to federal law enforcement offices, and because it was the last kind of neighborhood anyone would expect a national police chief to be living in. That choice did not save him. Myan returned home shortly before 1 a.m. His two bodyguards, named Leobardo Plata Hernández and Daniel de la Vega Hernández, were with him. As he opened the door of his apartment building, the gunman was already inside, waiting. He opened fire at close range. Myan was hit between 8 and 10 times. He was struck in the chest multiple times and once in the hand. The two bodyguards were wounded but returned fire and, together with neighbors and arriving officers, managed to subdue and capture the attacker at the scene. Edgar Myan was rushed to Metropolitan Hospital. He survived for several hours on the operating table. He died from his injuries early on the morning of May 8, 2008. He was the highest-ranking Mexican law enforcement officer ever killed on duty up to that point in the country's modern history. The Mexican government called it a cowardly act against an exemplary official. His funeral was attended by President Felipe Calderón, by the top general of the Mexican Army, Guillermo Galván, and by nearly every senior figure in the Mexican federal security apparatus. Mexican investigators arrested 5 people in connection with the murder in the days that followed, including a man named Montes, who was found with a list of license plates belonging to the vehicles of 5 other federal police commanders. One of those license plates belonged to Roberto Velasco Bravo, another senior federal investigator who had been shot a week earlier outside his own Mexico City home. The investigation made it clear that Edgar Myan had not been killed in a spontaneous moment. He had been hunted for months. Every safe house he raided, every arrest he oversaw, every weapons seizure he stood behind at a press conference, had added another line to the ledger the Sinaloa cartel was keeping on him. When they finally collected, they did it at his own front door in the middle of the capital city. The killing of Edgar Myan was not a single event. It was the middle of a week-long campaign to decapitate the Mexican federal police from the top down. The very next morning, the cartels struck again, this time against another senior commander who lived just a short drive away. Section 5. Commander Esteban Robles Espinosa. The week of May 8, 2008 in Mexico City had already broken records nobody wanted broken. The acting head of the Federal Preventive Police had been shot dead at his own front door. Before him,
Another senior federal police investigator had been killed outside his home on May 1st. Two of the most important anti-cartel officials in the country had been eliminated inside 8 days, both inside the capital,
both in their own neighborhoods. The Mexican security establishment was still trying to process what had happened when the cartels hit them again the very next morning. Esteban Robles Espinosa was a career officer. He had spent decades inside the Mexico City police system, working his way up through its investigative branches. By the mid-2000s, he had become the commander of Mexico City's investigative police force, one of the most senior policing positions in the federal district. In the years before that, he had held a job that made him a specific kind of enemy to organized crime. From the late 1990s until 2003, he had headed Mexico City's anti-kidnapping unit. That unit was responsible for going after the abduction rings that had turned parts of Mexico City into a place where business owners and middle-class families were being snatched off the streets on a weekly basis. Many of those abduction rings had direct ties to the cartels. Some of them were actually run by active cartel members who used kidnapping as a side business to generate cash between drug shipments. In that role, Robles had personally signed off on hundreds of investigations, many of which ended with arrests that cost the cartels both money and personnel. Every successful kidnapping case he closed was a blow to a criminal organization somewhere. Every hostage his unit rescued was a ransom the cartels did not collect. After leaving the anti-kidnapping unit, he moved into a role on the Mexico City Police Internal Affairs Commission, which put him in charge of identifying and removing corrupt officers from the city police force. That meant his job was, very specifically, to root out the officers who were taking cartel money. He was the person standing between the cartels and the police department they were trying to buy. By May of 2008, he was the commander of the entire investigative police force for Mexico City. His signature appeared on case files for organized crime investigations across the capital. He knew the names. He knew the addresses. He knew which officers were on the take and which ones were not. In a city where the cartels had spent years building networks of informants, paid protectors, and compromised commanders, Esteban Robles was exactly the kind of man they could not afford to let keep working. He had never reported a death threat. According to the Mexico City Judicial Police Department, there was no formal record of any warning, any extortion attempt, or any cartel contact directed at Commander Robles in the days or weeks before he was killed. That was not unusual. Men in his position often did not report threats, either because they did not want to alarm their families, or because they knew that reporting a threat would not actually change anything. The cartels rarely warned the officers they intended to kill. They simply waited and struck. On the morning of May 9, 2008, at approximately 8:30 a.m., Commander Robles stepped out of his home in Mexico City to begin his workday. He was leaving through his front door when a group of armed men approached him at close range. They opened fire. He was hit 8 times. His bodyguards were not able to stop the attack. The commander was rushed to a hospital, but his injuries were too severe. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. His killing came less than 24 hours after the killing of Edgar Myan Gomez, and exactly 8 days after the killing of Roberto Velasco Bravo. 3 of the most senior anti-organized crime officers in the Mexican federal and Mexico City police systems were now dead. All 3 had been killed at or near their own homes. All 3 had been taken out in coordinated professional hits. All 3 had been officers who had built their careers going after exactly the kinds of criminals who had ordered their executions. Mexican investigators working the case connected the 3 killings within hours. The same license plate list that had been recovered from suspects in the Myan case included information on Roberto Velasco. Intelligence pointed in one direction: the Sinaloa cartel, and specifically the Beltran Leyva wing of it.
had drawn up a kill list of senior federal and Mexico City police officials
and was working its way down the list. The goal was not simply revenge for individual arrests. The goal was to paralyze the Mexican police response at the command level by taking out as many senior officers as possible in as short a time as possible. The cartel wanted every other police commander in Mexico to wake up that week and realize that no rank, no office, no city was high enough to keep them safe. The strategy, from the cartel's point of view, worked. In the days following Esteban Robles Espinosa's killing, Mexican government officials appeared in front of cameras and vowed to fight back harder. President Felipe Calderón gave speeches calling for unity. The United States Congress was urged to speed up the Mérida Initiative, a billion-dollar security aid package for Mexico. But inside the police stations of Mexico City and the federal system, officers of every rank were quietly checking their own routines. They were changing their addresses. They were asking their families not to answer the door. They were looking at the men standing next to them in the command offices and wondering which of their own colleagues had been paid to point a gun at them from across the breakfast table. The cartels had proved that no city was safe for a police commander who could not be bought. The next cases would prove that the smaller the town, the more terrifying the message the cartels were willing to send. Section 6. Police Chief Manuel Castro Martinez Praxedis G. Guerrero is the kind of place most people outside of Mexico have never heard of. It sits in the Juarez Valley, a long, narrow strip of farmland hugging the U.S. border in the northern Mexican state of Chihuahua. The town itself has around 8,500 residents. The surrounding municipality has roughly 3,000 more. The main road through Praxedis runs east to west, parallel to the Rio Grande, and it eventually connects Ciudad Juarez to a string of small farming communities that sit across the border from Fort Hancock and Fabenz, Texas. In the 2000s, that road became one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world. Whoever controlled it controlled a direct smuggling pipeline into the United States. Two cartels decided they both wanted it. That decision turned Praxedis into a killing ground. By late 2008, the Juarez Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel were openly at war across the Juarez Valley. The Juarez Cartel operated through an armed wing known as La Línea. The Sinaloa Cartel had its own gunmen pushing in from the west. Both groups needed the local police force to either work for them or get out of the way. The police chief of Praxedis at the start of that year had already been killed. His successor had resigned almost immediately. For months, the town had been looking for anyone willing to take the job. In January of 2009, the municipal government finally found him. Manuel Martín Castro Martínez was 62 years old. He was a local man, the kind of older, experienced officer that smaller Mexican towns often trusted with the top police post. He had been around long enough to understand exactly what the job involved. He accepted it anyway. On January 13, 2009, he was sworn in as the new chief of police for Praxedis G. Guerrero. According to reporting by the Mexican newspaper El Diario de Juárez and follow-up coverage in international outlets, he had been on the job for just 4 days when a group of armed men came for him. On the afternoon of Saturday, January 17, 2009, Chief Castro Martinez was abducted together with 5 of his police officers and 1 civilian man. According to Chihuahua State Police officials, the group was taken by armed gunmen operating in an organized convoy. Nobody who saw the kidnapping spoke publicly about it at the time. In the Juarez Valley in that period, witnesses who spoke to the police had a habit of turning up as additional victims. The mayor's office received no ransom demand. The Chihuahua State Attorney General's office received no negotiating contact. The cartels were not interested in a negotiation. They were interested in sending a message.
On the afternoon of Sunday, January 18, 2009, less than 24 hours after the kidnapping, a package was left at the doorstep of the Praxedis G. Guerrero City Hall. When municipal employees opened it, they found an ice chest. Inside the ice chest was the severed head of Manuel Castro Martinez. A handwritten note was left inside with the remains. According to Mexican news outlets that reviewed the scene and the note, the message was a direct threat from La Línea, the armed wing of the Juarez cartel, aimed at the Sinaloa cartel, and at any police officer in the valley considering working with them. In the local slang of the cartel wars, the message was simple. The Juarez Valley belonged to La Línea. Any police chief who came in planning to cooperate with the rival cartel, or any police officer who failed to fall in line,
would end up the same way. Castro Martinez had been police chief for exactly 5 days. The other 5 police officers who had been taken with him, and the civilian man, were never recovered alive. Castro Martinez was formally identified and became one of at least 15 people who were killed execution-style in the area within a 24-hour period that weekend. Around the same time, in a separate incident in the nearby community of Santa Isabel, the bodies of 6 young men, most of them between the ages of 17 and 20, were discovered dumped together. The entire region was being swept by a wave of coordinated killings, and the head in the ice chest was meant to be the loudest single statement in the middle of all of it. The response inside the Praxedis G. Guerrero Police Department was immediate. Within days, most of the remaining officers in the municipal force resigned. So did many of the officers in the neighboring town of Guadalupe, just a few miles down the road. By the end of that month, the Praxedis police force had effectively collapsed. Earlier in the week, 2 members of the Guadalupe police force had also been killed. The entire valley had been cleared of municipal law enforcement in a matter of weeks. For more than a year afterward, the town of Praxedis G. Guerrero had no permanent police chief at all. Nobody would apply for the job. Mayor José Luis Guerrero repeatedly told reporters that every qualified candidate refused to even discuss it. The town essentially lived under the control of whatever armed group happened to be passing through at any given hour. Residents stopped going out after dark. Businesses closed. People who could afford to leave the valley left. In October of 2010, a 20-year-old criminology student named Marisol Valles Garcia, who was the mother of an infant son, became the only person to accept the open police chief position. International news organizations called her the bravest woman in Mexico. Within 5 months, the same kind of threatening phone calls that had circled Manuel Castro started circling her. She fled across the border and eventually requested asylum in the United States. The head in the ice chest had accomplished exactly what the cartel intended. It turned an entire municipality into a place where no honest officer could safely serve. But Praxedis was not the only town the cartels were trying to empty out that year, and the next attack would take that same message and deliver it in a way that rewrote what Mexican police commanders thought was even possible. Section 7. The bodyguards of Minerva Bautista Gomez. Michoacán is one of the most beautiful states in Mexico. It sits along the Pacific coast in the central part of the country. It has forests, lakes, agricultural valleys, and a colonial capital city called Morelia that draws tourists from around the world. It is also the birthplace of a criminal organization known as La Familia Michoacana. By the spring of 2010, La Familia Michoacana had taken over enormous stretches of the state. It controlled drug shipments, it ran protection rackets against local farmers, it kidnapped for ransom, and it had spent years putting police chiefs and politicians on its payroll. When local officials refused to accept that arrangement, the cartel had a history of burning vehicles, ambushing convoys, and leaving severed heads as receipts.
Into this environment walked a 37-year-old state official named Minerva Bautista Gomez. Bautista was the Secretary of Public Security for the state of Michoacán. That made her the top police official in the state. She had a reputation among her own officers as the kind of boss who actually read the intelligence reports and asked hard questions about whose names kept showing up on the cartel payroll. According to a Mexican federal police operative named Juan Diego Ortiz, who was later arrested and interrogated by the federal police,
La Familia Michoacana considered Bautista a direct threat. Ortiz told investigators that the cartel had specifically ordered her execution because of changes she had made inside the state police department that were hurting the cartel's operations. She was rotating commanders out of cartel-controlled zones. She was firing officers suspected of collusion. She was refusing to do what so many state officials in Michoacán before her had done, which was to quietly fall in line. On the night of April 23, 2010, Minerva Bautista attended the opening of the Expo Feria Michoacán 2010, a large annual state fair held just outside Morelia. She was there in an official capacity, inaugurating the event alongside other local officials. She stayed for most of the evening. Shortly after midnight, now into the early hours of April 24th, she left the fairgrounds to return home. Her convoy consisted of 2 state police vehicles and a compact car. She was seated in a gray Jeep Liberty with armored plating. Riding with her and in the other vehicles were 6 of her state police bodyguards. Other drivers who were leaving the fair at the same hour, ordinary families with their kids in the back seat, were scattered in traffic along the same road. About 800 meters from the fairgrounds, at a spot where the local road met the Mexico-Guadalajara highway, La Familia Michoacana was waiting. At approximately 12:45 a.m., roughly 20 gunmen from the cartel sprang the ambush. They had hijacked a white tractor trailer and used it to block the road ahead of the convoy. Then, from positions high up on 2 roadside embankments, they opened fire. They were armed with AK-47 assault rifles, AR-15 assault rifles, shotguns, and a .50 caliber sniper rifle, a weapon powerful enough to punch through the armored plating on most civilian vehicles. They also threw fragmentation grenades. Mexican investigators later collected more than 2,700 spent cartridges at the scene. The first bursts of gunfire killed 2 of Minerva Bautista's bodyguards before they could even fire back. One of them was Gilberto Molinero Tanori, who was 26 years old. The other was Subteniente Francisco Garcia Corral, a 45-year-old retired Army infantry officer who had taken a second career as a state police protection officer. Both of them died inside or next to their vehicles during the opening seconds of the attack. The other 4 bodyguards, wounded, bleeding, and in shock, managed to return fire with long guns against the positions on the embankments, while the driver of the armored jeep tried to push through the ambush zone. 2 civilians who were simply leaving the fair that night were also killed in the crossfire. Juan Ortiz Damian, age 60, was driving a family sedan with his relatives in it when his car was struck by cartel fire. Rogelio Fabián Melgarejo, age 30, was also killed at the scene. 9 other civilians, including several women and children who had been at the fair, were wounded and taken to a hospital in Morelia for treatment. Minerva Bautista herself was hit by bullet fragments and shrapnel from the grenades. Several rounds struck her armored jeep directly, and at least 1 grenade landed inside her vehicle without detonating. The armored plating on her SUV, rated at level 4, absorbed enough of the attack that she survived. She was rushed to the Star Medica hospital in southern Morelia, where doctors stabilized her. She later described stepping out of the vehicle after the shooting stopped and seeing the bodies of her own bodyguards on the pavement. She called it the worst scene she had ever witnessed. The Michoacán State Attorney General, Jesus Montejano Ramirez, told reporters that the level of firepower used in the ambush, including the .50 caliber weapon, concentrated grenade use, and the use of a hijacked trailer as a roadblock,
showed a military style of planning. Within weeks, the Mexican federal police arrested Juan Diego Ortiz, the former state patrol chief turned cartel operative, who confessed to participating in the ambush and provided the federal government with its first detailed account of La Familia Michoacana's motive. Bautista remained in her post for 3 more months after the attack, before eventually stepping down. Gilberto Molinero Tanori and Francisco Garcia Corral did not die because they had refused cartel money. They died because their boss refused to take it, and because the cartel decided that killing her protectors was the fastest way to get to her. They stood in the line of fire so a state official could keep doing her job. And the 2,700 spent shell casings on that Michoacan road are the physical record of what their loyalty cost them. Bautista survived that night because of armor, good driving, and luck. Other officers working in cartel country had none of those things, and in the same year her bodyguards were buried, a 38-year-old lawyer in the state just north of Michoacan took a police chief's job while announcing publicly that she owed nothing to anyone. The cartels decided to test that claim within weeks. Section 8. Police Chief Ermila Garcia Kinyones Meoki is a small farming town in the northern Mexican state of Chihuahua. It sits about 70 kilometers south of the state capital, Chihuahua City. Most of the roughly 45,000 people who live in the municipality work in agriculture or in small local businesses. For most of its history, Meoki was the kind of town where major crime was rare, and the local police spent most of their shifts dealing with traffic violations and disputes between neighbors. Then, the cartel wars came north. By 2010, Chihuahua State was at the center of one of the bloodiest turf battles in Mexican history. The Juarez Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel were fighting for control of the border. Los Zetas were pushing into the region from the east. In just 1 year, Chihuahua accounted for roughly 1/3 of all drug war deaths in the entire country. Meoki, once a quiet place, had logged 40 drug-related killings in the first 11 months of 2010 alone. When the municipal government of Meoki needed a new chief of police that fall, the job was already considered a death sentence. The men who had been approached for the position refused it. The idea of a local official standing up to Los Zetas, who operated openly in that part of Chihuahua, was simply too much for anyone in town to accept. Ermila Garcia Kinyones, a 38-year-old woman, walked into the mayor's office and said she would take it. She was not the kind of person the cartels were used to dealing with. Ermila Garcia was a trained lawyer. She had spent years working as a prosecutor and as an investigator for the Mexican Federal Attorney General's office. That meant she had both the legal education and the practical law enforcement experience that most small-town police chiefs in Mexico did not. She had never been married. She did not have children. She lived with her parents, whom she supported financially. Her friends and co-workers knew her as someone who was serious, careful, and unwilling to bend rules. She understood exactly what taking the police chief position meant, and she understood exactly what kind of people would be calling her to make offers in the weeks ahead. On October 9, 2010, she was officially sworn in as the chief of the 90-person police force in Meoki. Her officers took to calling her La Jefa, which in Spanish means the boss, but in the informal way a team uses for a leader they respect rather than fear. She threw herself into the work right away. She refused to accept a bodyguard detail. She refused to carry a personal weapon. She drove her own car to and from work every day without an escort. When people around her warned her that these choices were dangerous, she would reply with a line that became famous in the Mexican press after her death. She said that if you do not owe anything to anyone, then you have nothing to fear. It was not a slogan. It was the way she actually ran her life. And the cartels, who had built their entire business model around convincing local officials that they did in fact owe them something, recognized exactly what she was saying. She was police chief for 51 days. On the morning of Monday, November 29, 2010, Ermila Garcia left her parents' home in Meoki and began her usual drive to work.
It was a route she took every single weekday, and she was traveling alone, without any of the bodyguards the municipal government had repeatedly offered her. At approximately 7:20 a.m., as she was passing through a small community called Los Garcia, about 10 kilometers outside Meoki, a convoy of gunmen caught up to her. According to the Chihuahua State Attorney General's office, the attackers were driving 2 separate trucks and had been tracking her movement that morning. They boxed her vehicle in and opened fire. At least 3 shots struck her car. She was hit multiple times and died at the scene. The State Attorney General's spokesman, Carlos Gonzalez, confirmed the killing within hours. There were no eyewitnesses willing to talk to the police. Chihuahua in 2010 was a place where speaking to investigators about a cartel hit was itself a way to get killed. No arrests were ever made in her case. Mexican authorities stated openly that the killing was consistent with a pattern of Los Zetas operations in that part of the state. Security experts told reporters at the time that La Jefa had been targeted specifically because she had stepped into a role that the cartel expected to control, and because her public statements about not owing anything to anyone had been heard and interpreted inside the cartel exactly the way she had meant them. Her killing was part of a wider pattern of attacks on women in law enforcement in Chihuahua that year. Just weeks earlier, a 20-year-old criminology student named Marisol Valles Garcia had taken the police chief job in Praxedis G. Guerrero, the same town where Manuel Castro Martinez had been killed the previous year, and the international media had already started calling her the bravest woman in Mexico. A 28-year-old officer named Erika Gandara was at the same time serving as the only remaining police officer in the nearby border town of Guadalupe, after every other officer on the force had either been killed or resigned. Gandara would be abducted from her home by 10 gunmen on December 23, 2010, less than a month after Hermila Garcia was killed. She was never seen again. Hermila Garcia's funeral in Meoki drew hundreds of people. Her family gave interviews afterward in which they said she had known the danger from the first day, that she had taken the job out of love for her town, and that she would not have changed her decision even knowing how it would end. Reporters who had interviewed her in the weeks before her death quoted her one line over and over. "If you do not owe anything to anyone, you have nothing to fear." It became her epitaph. The cartels had killed a woman who refused to join them, and they had killed her precisely to prove that her words were wrong. __quote_3___. The next case shows what happens when a police investigator makes that same refusal and then compounds it by sharing evidence with the foreign press. Section 9. State Police Commander Rolando Armando Flores Villegas. Falcon Lake is an enormous man-made reservoir that sits directly on the border between Texas and Mexico. It covers around 84,000 acres of water. Half of the lake belongs to the United States. The other half belongs to Mexico, specifically to the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. In the fall of 2010, the Tamaulipas side of Falcon Lake was controlled entirely by a cartel called Los Zetas. The Zetas had originally been a team of elite Mexican army deserters hired by the Gulf Cartel as enforcers. By 2010, they had broken away and become the most violent criminal organization in Mexico. They used the Mexican half of the lake as a smuggling corridor for drugs and people moving north into the United States. They operated a fleet of small boats staffed with armed men. American fishermen who accidentally drifted into Mexican waters had repeatedly been warned off at gunpoint over the previous year. On September 30th, 2010, an American couple named David and Tiffany Hartley went for a ride on the lake on 2 jet skis. They crossed into the Mexican side to look at a historic flooded church that had been a local tourist attraction for decades.
According to Tiffany Hartley, 3 boats filled with armed men came after them. Her husband was shot in the head in the water. She was chased back toward the American side and escaped only because the gunman apparently decided not to follow her all the way across the border. David Hartley's body was never recovered. The case exploded into international news. Tiffany Hartley appeared on American morning television. The governors of Texas and Tamaulipas got involved. And the Mexican state police commander assigned to lead the investigation was a man named Rolando Armando Flores Villegas. Flores Villegas was the chief of the state police investigative unit in the Mexican border city of Ciudad Miguel Alemán in Tamaulipas. Ciudad Miguel Alemán sits just south of Falcon Lake. It was, and still is, one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico. In the fall of 2010, the entire area around it was being violently contested between Los Zetas and their former partners in the Gulf Cartel, who had recently split and gone to war. Flores Villegas was described by his own staff as a dedicated investigator. His secretary, a woman named Eva Rodriguez, later told CNN that he was very committed to his job and that he had never mentioned receiving any specific threats from drug traffickers. In Tamaulipas in 2010, that was less a sign of safety and more a sign that he simply did not talk about them. What he did do was work the case aggressively. Over the first weekend of October 2010, Flores Villegas personally led a team of state investigators in the search for David Hartley's body on the Mexican side of Falcon Lake. His convoy was attacked during the search by Zeta gunmen. Mexican army units nearby responded and killed 3 of the attackers. No officers were hurt in that particular engagement. Flores Villegas kept the investigation going. And then he did something that, inside Los Zetas' way of operating, was a death sentence. On the weekend of October 9th and 10th, 2010, Flores Villegas met with reporters from a South Texas television station, KRGV Channel 5 News in Reynosa. He handed them official Mexican state documents. Those documents identified 2 Mexican brothers, Juan Pedro and José Manuel Saldívar Farías, as the primary suspects in the killing of David Hartley. They were, according to the documents, members of Los Zetas and part of a river pirate group that had been terrorizing boaters and small-town residents in the Falcon Lake region for months. Flores Villegas told the station that the men had not yet been arrested. The American news channel ran the story. The suspects' names and a last known address for one of them were broadcast across Texas and repeated in Mexican media. It was the kind of move state police commanders in Mexico almost never made. Investigators in cartel territory generally did not put suspects' names on foreign television. The information was supposed to stay in the case file, quietly, where the cartel had a better chance of making the file disappear. Flores Villegas had just made that option impossible. On Monday, October 11th, 2010, he failed to return home that evening. His family reported him missing. His staff at the Ciudad Miguel Alemán office had no idea where he was. And then, on the morning of Tuesday, October 12th, a package was delivered to a Mexican army garrison in the area. Inside the package was a suitcase. Inside the suitcase was the severed head of Rolando Armando Flores Villegas. The news was broken publicly by a Texas state representative named Aaron Peña on Twitter. Zapata County Sheriff Sigifredo Gonzalez Jr., a longtime law enforcement liaison with Mexican police in the Falcon Lake region, confirmed the identification to the Associated Press. A spokesman for the Tamaulipas State Attorney General's office, Rubén Darío Ríos, confirmed the killing publicly on the afternoon of October 12th. Texas Governor Rick Perry told reporters the same day that the killing was a direct message from the cartel to Mexican law enforcement, telling investigators to stay out of Zeta territory. He said the cartel's clear intent was to intimidate police officers and agents on both sides of the border. He urged the United States to respond by putting more law enforcement and military resources on the border, not fewer. 2 years later, in October of 2012, the Mexican Navy arrested a senior Zeta commander named Salvador Alfonso Martinez Escobedo, who went by the street name La Ardilla, which translates as the Squirrel. In a public statement, the Mexican Navy formally identified Martinez as a suspect in the killing of David Hartley and in the beheading of Rolando Armando Flores Villegas. He was also named as a suspect in the San Fernando mass killings of 72 migrants and in the burial of more than 200 bodies in Zeta clandestine graves across Tamaulipas. Flores Villegas had done nothing more than share evidence with reporters the cartel wanted to keep hidden. For that, a police commander lost his life and was used as a warning to every other investigator within 500 miles of the border. But the cartels would go on to prove that they were capable of doing to 13 officers at once what they had done to this one man alone. Section 10. Security Secretary Alfredo Alonzo Lopez and the Coyuca de Benitez ambush. The state of Guerrero sits on the southern Pacific coast of Mexico. It is home to the famous beach resort of Acapulco, which once drew movie stars and honeymooners from around the world. Behind that coastline, Guerrero is also one of the poorest states in Mexico and one of the biggest producers of opium poppy and marijuana in the entire country. By 2023, that combination had made Guerrero a battleground. More than a dozen different criminal groups were fighting for control of the drug routes and the extortion rackets, including the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, La Familia Michoacana, the Sinaloa Cartel, the Beltran Leyva organization, and a local group called Los Granados. That year alone, more than 340 police officers were killed across Mexico. Guerrero ranked second in the country for officer killings. Out of every state in the Republic, only Guanajuato was more dangerous for a person wearing a police uniform. Coyuca de Benitez is a municipality on the Costa Grande of Guerrero, about 30 kilometers northwest of Acapulco. It is surrounded by coastal jungle, lagoons, and small fishing communities. By 2023, the entire area had come under pressure from Los Granados, a criminal organization run for more than a decade by a man named Salvador Granados Vargas, whose street name was Chava Granados. Los Granados had a documented history of trying to force local police officers to work for them. Officers who refused recruitment were threatened. Officers who kept refusing tended to disappear. That was the backdrop for what happened on October 23rd of that year. Alfredo Alonzo Lopez was the Secretary of Public Security for the municipality of Coyuca de Benitez. That made him the top police official in the town. His predecessor in that job, a man named David Borja Padilla, had himself survived an assassination attempt in December of 2022, in which 3 of his officers had been killed and he had been wounded. Borja had resigned after the attack. Alonzo Lopez had stepped into the vacancy, knowing exactly what had happened to the man he was replacing. Serving alongside him as the director of the local municipal police was an officer named Honorio Salinas Garay. Together, these 2 men ran a municipal police force of around 60 officers, operating inside territory that Los Granados considered their own. On the morning of Monday, October 23, 2023, the Coyuca de Benitez Municipal Police received a call. Somebody was reporting an active shooting incident on the highway that runs between Acapulco and the coastal town of Zihuatanejo. That highway, Federal Highway 200, is one of the busiest routes on the Guerrero coast. Alonzo Lopez, Honorio Salinas Garay, and a patrol of municipal officers loaded up and responded to the call. There was no actual shooting happening. The call was a trap. At around noon, in the community of El Papayo, about 20 kilometers northwest of the main town of Coyuca de Benitez, and about 50 kilometers from Acapulco, the police patrol drove directly into a coordinated ambush. According to Guerrero state prosecutors, and later reporting by the Mexican newspaper El Financiero, at least 30 gunmen in a convoy of more than 16 vehicles were waiting along the highway. They opened fire on the patrol at close range. 7 officers were killed at the scene. Among those 7 were Alfredo Alonzo Lopez and Honorio Salinas Garay themselves. Investigators later recovered dozens of spent rifle cartridges along the side of the road. 6 other officers from the same patrol were not killed at the scene. They were captured alive. The gunmen took them to other locations.
Those 6 officers were later found dead in different spots across the Coyuca de Benitez area. 2 additional people were wounded during the ambush itself. The final count was 13 officers dead in a single coordinated attack, a figure that matched the worst single-day police killings in modern Mexican history. Within days, Mexican federal authorities deployed 300 members of the National Guard to Coyuca de Benitez to try to retake control of the area. The Guerrero State Vice Prosecutor for Investigations, Gabriel Alejandro Hernandez Mendoza, held a video press conference and committed the state government to a full investigation. He acknowledged that the security officials in Coyuca de Benitez had not formally reported receiving threats to state authorities before the attack. In the following months, reporting by specialized outlets including Cartel Insider and public statements linked to the regional cartel intelligence investigation known as the Guacamaya leaks, a large trove of leaked Mexican military documents connected the killing directly to Los Granados. The attribution that emerged was specific. The officers had been killed because they had refused to be recruited by the cartel. Los Granados had demanded cooperation. The officers had said no. The ambush at El Papayo was the response. By the end of October 2023, Mexican federal forces had engaged Los Granados gunmen in a series of running gun battles across Coyuca de Benitez and the neighboring municipality of Tecpan de Galeana. 3 suspected hitmen were killed in one of those confrontations, and 15 others were arrested in the days that followed. Guerrero Attorney General Jesus Torres Ojeda later announced that 11 of those 15 arrested men were not even Mexican citizens. 10 were Guatemalan nationals, and 1 was from El Salvador. The cartels operating in Guerrero had begun importing foreign contractors for their killings because the risk of being recognized on home ground had become too high. Alfredo Alonzo Lopez and Honorio Salinas Garay and the 11 other officers who died with them that afternoon had answered a fake distress call out of the exact instinct that makes somebody sign up for a municipal police badge in the first place. They went out because somebody said there was trouble on the highway. Their families were given back their bodies. The cartel that killed them remains active in the same municipality today. Mexico's 2023 official tally for police officers killed that year was more than 340. These 13 were 13 of them. Across 40 years, 5 countries of reporting, multiple cartels, and dozens of funerals, the same equation has played out in the same way. An officer is offered the cartel's silver. The officer says no. The cartel sends the lead. Voldemar Franklin Quintero and Jaime Ramirez Gomez proved it in Colombia. Alejandro Dominguez Co, Edgar Myan Gomez, Esteban Robles Espinosa, Manuel Castro Martinez, the bodyguards of Minerva Bautista Gomez, Hermila Garcia Kinyones, and Rolando Armando Flores Villegas proved it again in Mexico. And Alfredo Alonzo Lopez and his 12 men proved it one more time in 2023 on a coastal highway in the middle of a country that still has not found a way to make their refusal safe. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.